Senate gaveling back in for general speeches. They'll be debating the nomination of Robert Wilkins to serve on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. A vote to move forward on that nomination is scheduled for 5:30 Eastern Time. Also today, possible work on bills that would expand FDA oversight of pharmacies and 2014 defense programs. Also today, the Senate Homeland Security Committee will be examining the impact of digital currencies. We'll have that hearing live at 3 p.m. Eastern over on our companion network, C-SPAN 3. Live coverage now from the floor of the U.S. Senate.
The Senate will come to order, and the chaplain, retired Admiral Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Our Father, be with us not only in great moments of experience, but also during mundane and common tasks of life. Through the power of your Spirit, may our senators mount up with wings like eagles, running without weariness and walking without fainting. Lord, give them the wisdom to be patient with others, ever lenient to their faults, and ever prompt to appreciate their virtues. Rule in their hearts, keeping them from sin and sustaining their loved ones in all of their tomorrows. Surround them with the shield of your favor as you provide them with a future and a hope. We pray in your sovereign name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
I move to proceed to calendar number 91, S. 1197.
Clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 91, S. 1197, a bill to authorize appropriations for fiscal year 2014 for military activities of the Department of Defense and so forth and for other purposes.
Mr. President, I now ask unanimous consent the cloture motion with respect to H.R. 3204, the compounding bill be withdrawn, the pending motion amendments be withdrawn, and the Senate now vote on passage of the bill.
Without objection, the cloture motion is withdrawn. The pending motion and amendment are withdrawn.
Is there further debate?
Is there further debate? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it.
I ask consent the motion reconsider.
Those passed.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent the motion reconsider be laid on the table. There be no intervening action or debate.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I see our friend here who has returned from his surgery on the death of his son. If he wants to say something before I complete, next thing. Okay. All right, Mr. President, through the chair to the Senior Senator Oklahoma, we're glad to have him back, and we've all empathized with something only a parent could understand, and I am grateful to him for the example he sets for all of us. Mr. President, I ask consent that, let me say this. We're going to be in a period of morning business then until 5 o'clock today. Following that morning business, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the nomination for Robert Wilkins to be a circuit judge for the D.C. Circuit. At 5:30, there'll be up to 2 roll call votes then. Cloture on the Wilkins nomination, and if cloture is not invoked, there'll be a second cloture vote on the defense authorization bill. Mr. President, Today, the Senate will consider yet another qualified nominee to be a D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals judge, considered by many to be the second highest court in all the land. It's troubling that Senate Republicans, for the fourth time this year, appear poised to reject an exceedingly capable nominee to this court for blatantly political reasons. They've blocked 3 highly qualified female D.C. Circuit nominees in a row: Caitlin Holligan, Patricia Millett, and Nina Pollard. Today they're expected to block confirmation of District Judge Robert Wilkins, an extremely competent and experienced nominee, and this had bipartisan support. I say that because no one has questioned his qualifications or abilities. Likewise, no senator objected to the qualifications of Ms. Halligan, Ms. Millett, or Ms. Pollard. Instead, Republicans have blocked these nominees solely to deny President Obama his constitutional right to appoint judges. In years past, my Republican colleagues agreed to block judicial nominees only in, quote, extraordinary circumstances, close quote. These are their words, not mine. In 2005, the senior senator from South Carolina, Senator Lindsey Graham, defined extraordinary circumstances for the benefit of this body. He, being a highly qualified trial lawyer, I think he's qualified to respond and set this definition that we all agreed with. Here's what he said, quote, "Ideological attacks are not an extraordinary circumstance. To me, it would have to be a character problem, ethics problem, some allegation about the qualifications of the person, not an ideological bent," close quote. No senator, I repeat, no senators questioned the character, ethics, or qualifications of the 3 women have already been rejected for the D.C. Circuit. No one has questioned the character, ethics, or qualifications of Judge Wilkins. So I'm frustrated that Republicans would once again filibuster such a highly qualified nominee, a nominee so highly qualified, in fact, that he was confirmed 3 years ago by voice vote to become a district court judge. He's an Indiana native who graduated with cum laude with a degree in chemical engineering. And then he got a law degree from Harvard. He's worked as a staff attorney for a well-regarded D.C. Public Defender Service. He was a partner specializing in white-collar defense, intellectual property, and complex civil litigation at the private law firm of Venable. Now, it's an outstanding law firm of lawyers all over the country. Judge Wilkins also helped shine a national spotlight on racial profiling when he brought a landmark lawsuit against the Maryland State Police in 1992 after he and 3 family members were stopped and searched. Why? Because they were African Americans. This was landmark litigation, Mr. President. This nominee has a bright legal mind, a remarkable dedication to the rule of law. Under normal circumstances, like the circumstances of his 2010 confirmation, he would be quickly confirmed. But now he faces a Republican filibuster. Unfortunately, the type of Republican obstruction we face today has become quite commonplace. President Obama's circuit court nominees, including nominees for the vital D.C. Circuit, have waited 7 times longer than those nominated by President Bush. Republicans claim they are blocking nominees to this crucial court because the court is underworked and doesn't need to fill its complement of judges. Republicans also claim that filling these 3 vacancies would amount to court packing. Mr. President, that is absurd on its face. My Republican colleagues were happy to confirm 4 Bush nominees to this court. In fact, 15 of the last 19 to the D.C. Circuit were appointed by Republican presidents. Appointing judges to fill vacant judicial seats is not court packing. It's a president's right as well as his duty. So I don't ask my Republican senators to support President Obama's nominees, or even that they vote for them. But it's right and proper that they should give President Obama nominees the same fair consideration afforded the nominees that came before them. Would the chair announce the business of the day?
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business until 5 p.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each. President. Senator from Oklahoma.
ask unanimous consent that my 10 minutes might be extended by about 10 more minutes.
Without objection.
Let me start off, Mr. President, before the leader leaves the floor, and I was hoping to do this before the chaplain of the Senate, Barry Black, left. I had a horrible loss 8 days ago, losing a son. And it was so touching to me, and I want to thank Barry Black, who included a good bit of some things about my son and about me in his opening prayer. And also the comments that were made, the very general comments were very helpful, were made by the majority leader. So I want to, through the chair, thank Harry Reid very much for the comments he made. Mr. President, we have something coming up that we're going to be talking about this week, and I'm a little disturbed because I don't know exactly when it's going to be coming up. I don't know how many objections there are going to be. I just know that there are some people who would want to use this since it is a must-pass bill. This is the National Defense Authorization Act. We've passed it every year for, I think, 51 years. We've never failed to pass it. This is not going to be the first year that we fail to pass it. But I'm hoping that our members will recognize how significant this is. First of all, I want to say, as the ranking member on the Senate Armed Services Committee, that I want to thank my colleague, the chairman of the committee, Chairman Levin, for his leadership and his cooperation that we enjoyed during the committee markup of this bill. We got it through the committee in a pretty fast order. People realized there's some things that had to be taken up on the floor, very controversial, 3 very controversial issues. Fine, this is where it should be taken up. It will be taken up. There will be amendments that I will strongly oppose, and some that I will support. But I've always considered the National Defense Authorization Act to be the most important piece of legislation Congress considers each year. Now, this bill contains crucial authorizations that support our men and women in harm's way in Afghanistan and around the world. It supports training of our service members, maintenance and modernization for their equipment to ensure they're prepared to overwhelm any adversary and return home safely to their loved ones. But, and this is the big but it does so only as the reduced defense spending will allow. It authorizes research and development efforts that will ensure we maintain technological superiority over our enemies and we can successfully defeat the threats of tomorrow. But again, it does so only, this is different, this has never happened before, when we are facing a reduction in our military spending that is so unacceptably low that it has caused our leaders in all 4 services, which I will read in just a moment, to talk about how this is life-threatening. But most importantly, one thing that we will continue to do is provide for the pay and the benefits of the brave men and women who are in harm's way. That's to defend this nation. In an era increasingly defined by partisan gridlock, the NDAA, that's the National Defense Authorization Act, is one of the rare occasions when members of both parties can come together out of a shared commitment to our military and men and women. This enduring commitment was exemplified again this year by the overwhelming bipartisan majority that supported the passage of the NDAA from committee in June. I look forward to continuing this tradition and this cooperation until we get this thing passed. Now, consideration of this year's NDAA comes at a pivotal moment for our national security. The global security environment we face is more volatile and dangerous than any other time in my memory, or I suggest in the history of this country. Yet our ability to protect the country against these growing threats is a serious risk. After losing $487 billion that just came out of the defense budget through the first 5 years of this administration, we now are looking at sequestration. sequestration is an outcome thought to be so egregious and irresponsible that it would never be allowed to happen. None of us believed it would happen, that we'd be facing, after already losing $487 billion from our defense system, to have to be facing sequestration. And I never can say sequestration without reminding people. Why is it that our budget, that only 18% of our budget goes to defending America, and yet they have been forced to endure 50% of the cuts? It's wrong. But nonetheless, that's what's been happening over the last, now we're looking at, it's been in effect for 8 months. It's drastic across-the-board cuts are exacerbating the effects of an already declining national security budget. Now, as a result, the military is experiencing a dramatic decline in readiness and capabilities. Let's put that chart up, if you would, John. And General Odierno, the Chief of Staff of the Army, recently said that his forces are at a, and I'm quoting now, quote, lowest readiness levels I've seen within our Army since I have been serving for the last 37 years, and that only 2 brigades are ready for combat. Only 2 brigades. This is General Odierno. The reason I wanted this chart put up, because it tells us where we are today. The orange, which is the huge cuts that come with sequestration, far greater than the rest of them. That's readiness. That's what we're talking about. Now, we do hear a lot about the cost of personnel and all of that, but that is in the lower blue. So you're not talking about, if you're able to do away with those, actually coming up with any major reductions. The yellow is force structure. Now, we're talking about, as Odierno said, down to only 2 brigades that are ready for combat. That's because of what's already been happening in the last 8 months in the force structure. The modernization is the green. Modernization is always the first thing to be cut when force cuts come in, because they figure that's something that you just don't feel the pain of today. But there it is, the orange. I want you to concentrate on that, because that's where it really would hurt. So we had General Odierno saying his forces were the lowest readiness levels he's seen in his 37 years in the United States Army. I was in the Army many, many years ago, and I can remember back then when it always had priority over everything. Defending America seemed to be the thing. Admiral Greenert, Chief of Naval Operations, he said, and I'm quoting him, he says, because of fiscal limitations and the situation we are in, we don't have another strike group trained and ready to respond on short notice in case of a contingency. We're tapped out. That's our Navy. Our top military leaders now warn that of being unable to protect American interests around the world. Admiral Winfield, he's the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the next to the highest military. He said earlier this year, and I'm quoting him, he said, there could be, for the first time in my career, instances where we may be asked to respond to a crisis and we will have to say we cannot. General Dempsey, the #1 military chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he's warned that continued national security cuts, and I'm quoting, he said, will, quote, severely limit our ability to implement our defense strategy. It will put our nation at a greater risk of coercion, and it will break faith with the men and women in uniform. And that's why I'm so troubled that this disastrous path that we're on, in the face of mounting threats to America, prolonged budgetary uncertainties, and the mindless sequestration cuts are crippling the people who are vital to our security, our men and women in the military. And to be clear, our military was facing readiness shortfalls even before sequestration took effect. Sequestration has only been in effect for 8 months. We never dreamed it would, after all the cuts that we've gotten out of it from, quite frankly, this administration. So the equipment, the problems that we have, rather than rebuild the ability of our military to defend the country, we're digging ourselves deeper in a hole. The longer we allow military readiness and capabilities to decline, the more money and time it will take to rebuild. We're falling victim to the misguided belief that as the wars of today wind down, we can afford to gut investments in our nation's defense. This is an irresponsible and dangerous course. You know, I remember back during the middle of the 90s, they talked about a peace dividend at that time. And I can remember they're saying, well, the Cold War is over, we no longer need that strong of a military. Now, in this day and age, it is so much more serious than it has been in the past. Our top military leaders agree in testimony before the Armed Services Committee last week. General Amos, he's the Commandant of the Marine Corps, he testified that if he is tasked to respond to a contingency in the current budget environment, and I'm quoting, "We will have fewer forces arriving less trained, arriving later to the fight. This would delay the buildup of combat power, allow the enemy more time to build its defenses, and would likely prolong combat operations altogether. This is a formula for more American casualties." That's the Commandant of the Marine Corps. Now, such an outcome would be immoral and a dereliction of duty. If we expect the men and women of our military to go into harm's way to protect America, we have an obligation to provide them with the training, technology, and capabilities required to decisively overwhelm any adversary at any time and return safely home to their loved ones. Under this sequestration, we can't do it. This is what we're talking about right here when I say we are talking about the obligation to provide the training, technology, and capabilities. That's all that orange. That means that's what we're not going to do. This is why ending sequestration and protecting the readiness of our military men and women remains my top priority. However, something must be done now to mitigate the devastating impacts to readiness until we can find a long-term solution. This is why now, again, I'm just talking a little bit about the significance of having our defense authorization bill come to the floor, get it started, start working on amendments. This is what is important. But in order to address the shortfalls that we have, I have an amendment that would phase sequester in a way that would allow our senior military leaders to enact reforms without disproportionately degrading our ability to train and prepare our military men and women to protect this country. Now, let me say quickly, one of my closest friends in this chamber is one of the senators from Alabama, Jeff Sessions. Jeff Sessions, as we speak, is on a plane on his way back from California. So he can't be here. Jeff Sessions has come up with an amendment, and he's on the Budget Committee. He's a real budget hawk, and he still is willing to increase the military by 1% with a proposed amendment that he might have. When Jeff Sessions gets back, I'm going to talk to him about going together on his amendment so that we can maybe merge the two amendments together. My amendment seeks to leverage what General Odierno refers to as ramping, a rephasing of the sequestration cuts that reduce the impact of fiscal year 2014 and 2015 to a more manageable level and shifts the remainder of the required cuts in the remaining years. So we're talking about you wouldn't feel it as much in these first 2 years, and yet we would make up for it, and that's why it is budget neutral. The Congressional Budget Office told me that this amendment will not score, and that's very important to a lot of people. Let me be real clear. I remain committed to ending sequestration of our military men and women. My amendment does not fix sequestration, nor will it impede my continued push for fixing sequestration. We're going to continue to do that. It's immoral that we're not doing it. However, the damage being done to our military is so egregious and reckless under the current sequester mechanism that I have no choice but to take this step to avoid an even greater readiness catastrophe that would seriously damage our national security. I talked just a few minutes ago to General Odierno. He's the commander, he's the top person in the United States Army. I've made a couple of notes here. I want to make sure I don't misquote him because he said if we can do what we're trying to do with this amendment, in other words, backload some of this stuff, and it would actually save money 3 or 4 years from now. Because if you start cutting right now across the board, as would be mandated by sequestering, then you're going to be cutting in areas where it's going to cost you more to come back and do that. So I think you'll find most of the military is very very anxious to do that. Again, I'm not going to introduce this until we have a chance to talk to Senator Sessions and hopefully come up with something that will be sellable to this body. In addition to my concerns about sequestration, this bill contains several provisions that I find deeply problematic. In particular, I strongly oppose the sections that would loosen restrictions on the transfer of detainees from Guantanamo Bay to the United States or to countries like Yemen that remain vulnerable to al-Qaeda and its terrorist affiliates. I've got to ad-lib here a little bit because I can't remember how many years I've been trying to save one of the greatest assets this country has, and that's Guantanamo Bay. I say to my good friend in the chair that this is one of the few good deals that we have, because we've had Guantanamo Bay since 1904, and it has cost us, I think, the total of $4,000 a year, and Castro forgets to collect about every other year. So it's one of the few good deals that we have out there. It's one of the only place you can put these combatants where they are in a position where they can be interrogated and we can save American lives. And I don't know why this President Obama, has this obsession to turn these people out of Guantanamo Bay back in the United States. He first did this his first year, 4 years ago. He had a plan. He had located, I think it was 17 places in America where he could send these terrorists back in. One of them happened to be in my state of Oklahoma at Fort Sill. I always remember that. I went down to Fort Sill. I say to the chair that because I found out that we have a small prison down there, and the major, a female who runs that prison, said to me, she said, I can't understand what's wrong with you people in Washington, why you have that perfectly good facility down there that will save American lives, and people are treated better than they've ever been treated before. One of the major problems we have down there is obesity, because they're eating so much. So it's not a matter of not being treated fairly. Well, for some reason, this president has had and one of the problems with turning these people back into America, into our system, is that a terrorist is not a criminal. A terrorist teaches they're in the business of teaching other people to be terrorists. You put them in our prison system, and they're going to be working on the people that are there. And that's why I had such strong feelings about the closing of Guantanamo, or the president's been trying to do that. We've stopped him from doing that for 4.5 years now. We will continue. However, they're trying to make it easier for them to take people out of Guantanamo Bay and send them to my state of Oklahoma and throughout America, and hopefully we can defeat that part of this bill. And while I'm pleased that the bill fully funds the budget request for missile defense and includes provision that would establish a radar site in the East Coast, I remain concerned that we are vulnerable to a growing ballistic missile threat from the Middle East. And let me comment here. I was upset. The first budget that President Obama had, I knew, and again, when you say liberal and conservative, that's not name-calling. Liberal simply means you want government to have more involvement in our lives, and he is a liberal person. And most liberals don't think we need a military to start with. And I always remember his first budget. I went over, Mr. President, I went over to Afghanistan so I could be there when he announced his budget. So knowing if I was doing it from there with the tanks going back and forth, I'd get some attention on it. And sure enough, it worked. So in that first budget, the President in his budget did away with our only fifth-generation fighter, the F-22, did away with our lift capacity, the C-17 did away with our future combat system, which had been the first advance of ground capability in probably 50 years. But I think the worst of everything, he did away with the site that we're building in Poland and the Czech Republic to be a ground-based interceptor that would take care of something coming from that direction into the United States. You see, Mr. President, we have 33 ground-based interceptors. They're all located on the West Coast. Now, our intelligence has told us since 2007 that Iran is going to have the capability of a weapon and a delivery system. By weapon, I'm talking about a nuclear weapon and a delivery system by 2015. We're talking about less than a year and a half from now. And he's going to have that capability. So we were building that for the purpose of being able to catch something coming from that direction. Well, then he took that out, and he stopped that. There's other problems with that, too, because I remember when we were trying to sell Poland and the Czech Republic on the idea. They said, are you sure now, if we agree and we make Russia angry at us by agreeing to have a ground-based interceptor in Poland and the radar in the Czech Republic, are you sure that some president isn't going to come along and pull the rug out from under us? And I said, I'm absolutely positive, and that's exactly what happened. Well, anyway, I only mentioned that because the radar site on the East Coast certainly would not be effective by the time that they're going to have that capability. But nonetheless, we are addressing it. And I'm pleased that under the Chairman Levin's leadership, the committee was able to reach a compromise during the markup to address the scourge of sexual assault in the military. The Senate bill includes 16 provisions that are specifically targeted to improving the tools the department, the services, the commanders have at their disposal for fighting sexual assaults. Includes an additional 12 provisions to make important improvements to the military justice system in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And this is a comprehensive, targeted legislative initiative that would address that. So that's going to be controversial. I understand that. I think a lot of us who have served in the military, it happens that I was in the military court many years ago, before most of you guys were born. And at that time, the one thing I learned, and this was way back then, that the commander's influence in discipline is necessary. And we're all going to keep that in mind as we look at some of these amendments. So I look forward to bringing this to the floor as soon as we can, and getting these controversial things out of the way. I'm hoping that I'll get favorable consideration of my amendment that's going to make it much less devastating to the military. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And here on the floor of the Senate in a quorum call, waiting for additional senators to take the floor. Majority Leader Harry Reid was the first on the floor with his opening statements. And the Senate passed a bill on drug compounding centers. That was by voice vote earlier, H.R. 3204. Later today, there will be up to 2 votes scheduled, 5:30 Eastern Time, a vote on whether or not to move forward on the nomination of Robert Wilkins to be a judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and then a vote to start work on defense spending. That's Senate Bill 1197. 60 votes needed for both the nomination and the defense authorization to move forward. Now, while we're in a quorum call here on the floor of the Senate, we'll go ahead and take a look at the White House briefing that's going on underway with Jay Carney.
But we have to obviously couple that with very intrusive verification procedures so that we can be confident that that is the case. So the end goal here is shared by everyone, and there is no daylight between the United States and Israel when it comes to that, and there's no daylight among the members of the P5+1.
There appears to be daylight in tactics and methods right now. I mean, everything that history you just described, Israel and the United States were very close on this, but now there are, through press conferences and statements from the Prime Minister repeatedly, a breach. It's obvious.
Well, I think everyone, and I think the Prime Minister said this, believes that we should explore whether or not this can be resolved peacefully. That is obviously a preference for everyone. And it is our view that the process we have in place with the P5+1 is the best way to explore that possibility, as we leave all options on the table, as we make clear that President Obama will not, as a matter of policy, allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. Achieving that goal is best done peacefully if that's possible. And going back to the beginning of your question, if the decision or the view is that we should not engage in negotiations, you're really, whether you're proactively choosing the use of force as the better alternative or simply disallowing or suggesting there's no path through which you can negotiate a diplomatic, peaceful resolution, you're still leaving yourself with only one other means to achieve that objective: prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And that's why we put in place a process working with our people.
The Israeli government is right now?
Well, look, we rather consult with Israel constantly on these issues. The president speaks with no other leader more frequently than he does.
They know all the details of the negotiations.
We again consult with the Israelis regularly. We share a significant amount of information on a variety of issues, but Iran is certainly one of them. You know, our commitment to Israel's defense is unshakable, and that is as true today as it's been every day that President Obama has been in office, and has overseen a policy that has provided, I think, even in the, or most importantly in the views of many Israeli leaders, the most tangible evidence of that commitment to Israel's security that they've ever seen. So, you know, that remains our policy, that remains our position, and we are going about this with our P5+1 partners in a way that ensures that any steps we take will require transparency and the ability to verify concrete steps by the Iranians. If in the end they are not, if they demonstrate that they are not willing to take the concrete steps necessary to prove to the world that they are giving up their nuclear weapons ambitions, then there's no deal. Simple as that. Margaret.
Thanks. I want to ask you about the OFA call tonight, but before I forget, I want to do a little cleanup question. On healthcare in the front row, you had said that in addition to what you're doing to improve the website, you're, quote, working with additional channels, and that sounded like maybe worth asking more about. Is this with business, or is the Lady Gaga tour back on, or what are we talking about for the additional channels?
I think what I was trying to refer was the fact that we have, in addition to the work we've done on the website, we have made more robust the channels available for, the alternate channels available for Americans to get information and to enroll. That includes by mail, by phone, or in person. And in response to the question about, direct enrollment, working with insurers, you know, we are having conversations with insurers all the time about that and other issues, all with the goal of maximizing the options available to Americans when it comes to enrolling in and purchasing quality, affordable, enrolling in the marketplace and purchasing quality, affordable health insurance.
But on the additional channels, you meant the channels that we've already talked about before in the past.
Well, but also, you know, we are also working to set up direct enrollment through insurance companies so that Americans could choose to enroll directly through the insurance company. And that's, you know, another method by which we can reach the same point that is the goal here. Again, it's the end here that matters, not necessarily the means. The means are important, and we have made clear our shared frustration with the problems that the website has experienced, but we have to make sure that there are other means available for the American people, even as we make improvements to the website.
On OFA, tonight the President will talk with OFA folks on a call. To the extent that you can talk about the policy as well as the political goals, more broadly than sort of trying to get the momentum back, what is he hoping to accomplish specifically with this call, and for what duration of time is he kind of laying forth a plan?
Well, I don't have an extensive preview of what the President will say. I can say that there are a lot of people out there who strongly support health insurance reform and who strongly supported and support the Affordable Care Act because of the promise that it represents. You know, this was, we are obviously in a moment of time, as applies to the Affordable Care Act, where a lot of focus, understandably, is being directed towards the problems with the website and other issues that have affected the rollout of the marketplaces. and that is as you would expect it to be. But we cannot forget, we need to step back and not forget that what was achieved in the passage of the Affordable Care Act was the culmination of a century-long effort by presidents and lawmakers to introduce health insurance reform, to make affordable quality health insurance more broadly available to average Americans, all undertaken with the point of view that in the wealthiest country on earth, health care should not be a privilege for a few, it should be available to all. And what we've seen is that passage of that legislation is only half the battle, and implementation of it is just as, in fact, more important, because we need to make sure that the promise is realized and that Americans across the country who have seen health care costs drive up their own costs, have seen in a process that's been underway for years and decades, have seen even their employer-based insurance change in ways that places more costs on them, and also have seen employers drop them, and have seen experiences, if they have been in the individual market, that are really challenging for them and create a lot of insecurity for them, that they are able to get the benefits of this new system that builds on, expands on the private insurance system that we have, but does it in a way that provides basic benefits and basic affordability to millions of Americans who didn't have them before.
It's really ACA focus call. It's not going to be about immigration or other...
Well, I can't rule out other topics, but I think that the President understands that there are a lot of people out there who believe deeply in the need to make sure that this is implemented properly, because millions of Americans fought hard for and believe in the benefits that the Affordable Care Act provides.
Very quickly, I'm sorry to take too much time. Since we've been talking, there's a story out by the Washington Post that says that Pete Raff may be leaving.
Mr. President, I ask consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection, the quorum call be suspended.
Mr. President, this afternoon the Senate passed and sent to the President legislation that Tennesseans and Americans will welcome, because it deals with the terrifying fungal meningitis outbreak that occurred more than a year ago and killed 16 Tennesseans and made many others sick. The problem at that time was sterile compounded drugs that turned out not to be sterile. And so when they were injected into patients for back pain or neck pain, those tainted drugs caused fungal meningitis and caused 16 Tennesseans to die and many others to become sick. And had it not been for the heroic efforts of the Tennessee State Department of Public Health, many others across the country might have been injected with these tainted medicines and become sick. So this is a very important piece of legislation on which senators and House members have been working on for a year. And I'm glad that it passed, and I'm sure the President will sign it. In our state, we know how personal this was. There's the story of Diana Reed in Brentwood, Tennessee, who was the caregiver for her husband who has Lou Gehrig's disease. She had neck pain, maybe because of helping him in and out of a wheelchair, went to the doctor, got an injection for her neck pain, and the next thing you know, she has fungal meningitis, and she dies. And still her husband with Lou Gehrig's disease lives on. That story has been told in many, many states, and we have been told by the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration that if we do not act, it will happen again. If we do not act, Commissioner Hamburg said, the question is not if, but when there will be another tragedy. So, Mr. President, we have acted. Now, no one should believe that we can guarantee that such a tragedy will never happen again, but for two reasons. It makes it much less likely that we'll have another tragedy like fungal meningitis as a result of contaminated drugs. Number one, we've cleared up the question of accountability. After this happened, and it was discovered that the tainted drugs came from the Massachusetts compounding pharmacy, there was a lot of finger-pointing back and forth between the FDA and the state board about who should have been regulating this pharmacy, because there were other trouble signs. This never should have happened if they had been properly regulated, either by the state or by the federal agency, the FDA. That often happens when there's not accountability, when it's not clear who's on the flagpole, as I like to say, when it's not clear who's in charge. I use the example of Admiral Hyman Rickover, who was a brusque Navy officer, but in the 1950s, when he was assigned the job of the nuclear Navy, he told his captains two things. He said, number one, you're in charge of the ship. Number two, you're in charge of the reactor. And if anything goes wrong with the nuclear reactor, your career's over. And as a result, Mr. President, and I'm sure as a result of that level of clear accountability, since the 1950s, there's never been a death as a result of a reactor accident on one of our nuclear ships. This legislation creates that kind of accountability for compounded drugs. It preserves the traditional role of states to regulate drug stores. Compounding is something almost every drug store does. We have 60,000 of those, and that's an important job of the states. Most states do an excellent job. It preserves the role of the Food and Drug Administration for manufacturers, those who manufacture large amounts of drugs which are prepared without an individual prescription. But it creates a new sort of facility, which we call outsourcing facility. And this facility is regulated by the FDA. And so two things have happened, as I say. One is either the FDA or the state is in charge of a compounding pharmacy. It'll be one or the other. Or the second thing is there's this new outsourcing facility, and a doctor or a hospital in Virginia or Tennessee may choose to buy all of its sterile drugs, for example, from a compounding pharmacy that's regulated by the FDA. It doesn't have to, but it may choose to do that. It may choose to do that. And we believe many will choose to do that, particularly with sterile drugs that are sent across state lines without a prescription. So this legislation affects the health and safety of millions of Americans. There's a second part of this legislation that was passed this afternoon that is equally important and in some ways more far-reaching. We call it track and trace around here. That's the shorthand name for it. 4 billion prescriptions are written every year, prescription drugs. And what this legislation does is attach a serial number to each drug that's manufactured that follows it from all the way from the drug manufacturer to the individual patient. And why is that important? It's important so that you will know if you're given a prescribed drug. It's important that you know it works, that it's not counterfeit, that it may be safe. It'll take several years to implement this, but the 4 billion prescriptions will now be able to be tracked and traced from the manufacturer to the consumer. So many of our disputes, Mr. President, are well advertised around the United States Senate. In fact, one could argue that that's what we're for, the resolution of disputes. If there weren't a dispute, we probably wouldn't be here. We'd just work everything out at the City Council or in the Governor's office or somewhere else. But the big issues of the day stand here. And some of those are hard to resolve. Obamacare is hard to resolve. Fixing the debt's hard to resolve. We have very different points of view. But on this issue, which was difficult to do, we've worked for a year on the compounding pharmacy bill, more than 2 years on the track and trace bill, very difficult to do. We were able to do it. I commend Senator Harkin, who's chairman of our committee here, Senator Franken, Senator Roberts, Senator Burr, Senator Bennett, many other members of the committee. We were able to involve many, many people in it and come out with a unanimous recommendation from our committee, and it was unanimous today. So just because it was unanimous, I don't want anyone to think it was easy. It was hard work, and it's just because it was unanimous, I don't want anyone to think it's not important. It's important in Tennessee to those 16 families who had a family member die, It's important to the dozens of families who are sick because of those injections. It's important to the families who may still become sick in our state and other states. And it's important to know that, number one, after this, we'll know who's on the flagpole. It's either the FDA or the state agency, and there will be no more finger pointing. And second, any doctor or hospital that chooses to buy its sterile compounded drugs that are shipped interstate in large amounts without prescriptions from an FDA-regulated facility may do that. So, Mr. President, this is a day of results in the United States Senate, which I'm glad to see. I thank the President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President. Senator from Arizona.
While he's here on the floor, I want to thank my colleague from Tennessee for this legislation, the hard work he's done on it, and also there was significant pain and difficulties experienced by his constituents in Tennessee, and this is something that I think will benefit all Americans and a rare bipartisan occasion around here which we should all celebrate. I thank my colleague from Tennessee. Mr. President, first of all, I'd like to obviously join all of my colleagues in welcoming back our dear friend, the Senator from Oklahoma, Senator Inhofe. We know he's gone through a very terrible family tragedy, and our thoughts and prayers continue to be with him and the members of his family, and we're very happy to see him back and working on this very important and leading and this very important aspect of our work here, and that is the Defense Authorization Act. Today I will have filed an amendment on behalf of Senator Sessions and myself. Senator Sessions, as we all know, the ranking member of the Budget Committee, to try to address the issue of this terrible effect of our defense establishment as a result of sequestration. Rather than go into the background of why it happened, the fact is that right now, in 2012 and 2013 and into 2014, we see a continued decline in funding for national defense, and then a rise as it's currently planned. This is current law. Well, obviously, it's not a rational approach, because our defense business and people and the Pentagon do not plan on a day-to-day or week-to-week or month-to-month basis. So what this amendment does is it preserves sequestration, which, by the way, I am opposed to, but the fact remains that in order to try to ease the burden of sequestration on our military, this would smooth out this dip that has taken place, and over an 8-year period until the expiration of current law in 2021 would next year and the year after, for 2014, 15, 16, and 17, would give increases in spending and then reductions in those out years, and still achieving the same reductions in spending as dictated by sequestration. Now, the reason why I say that is because we are looking at dramatic impact on our military if we allow that spending to go down to that level for 2014 before we start climbing back up. Now, what is happening to our military today is impactful, it's disgraceful, it is harmful. In this very unsettled world we live in, we are seeing unprecedented reductions in impact on our national security that we have not seen since the end of the Vietnam War. And 2 weeks ago, the Armed Services Committee held a hearing to understand how the sequester had impacted the Department of Defense, and we learned, according to the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Ray Odierno, continued sequestration along this line will cause the Army to end, restructure, or delay over 100 acquisition programs. The Army, already drawing down by 80,000 active duty troops, will be forced to reduce and eliminate an additional 60,000. The Guard and Reserve would be forced to remove tens of thousands of men and women from their ranks. It amounts to an almost 20% cut in troop strength over the next 5 years, and we result in an Army that has tens of thousands of fewer soldiers than it had in 2011. Unit training has been curtailed, so that by the end of 2014, if we go down here, General Odierno forecasts that only 15% of Army brigade combat teams will be fully ready in the event of a contingency. The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Greener, testified that sequester means the Navy will operate more sparsely across the globe and less able to reassure our allies that U.S. interests around the world are served. Commandant of the Marine Corps said that because of sequestration, he was mortgaging long-term modernization to pay for keeping his Marines trained and ready today, but he also said the plan is not sustainable. As equipment and facilities age, he won't be able to pay for their upkeep while simultaneously paying for training. What will give, unfortunately, is readiness. As all the service chiefs testified, readiness means lives. The lower the readiness, the greater the risk to soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines' lives in the event of a deployment. The Chief of Staff of the Air Force told us that the Air Force had to ground 13 combat squadrons, because they lacked the funding due to sequestration. Other squadrons' flying hours were cut in half. He warned that continued cuts to flying hours, which are a certainty under this present plan, will guarantee that many more squadrons will forego mission readiness in the coming years. General Welch's least damaging plan to pay for sequestration is to cut some 25,000 airmen and 500 aircraft, almost 10% of the aircraft inventory. Obviously, what is not reflected in these numbers is the impact on morale and retention. The Air Force is deeply concerned about the number of pilots it's losing due to private industry. My colleagues may not know that there's a large exodus of airline pilots that will be leaving the airlines due to retirement in the next few years. There's a recent story where a number of pilots were offered a bonus, Air Force pilots were offered a bonus of $225,000 to remain in the United States Air Force, and most of them turned it down. And you know why they're turning it down? It's because they're not flying, and they're not sure whether they're going to be flying. We are cutting their flying hours to the bone. We are grounding entire squadrons. We are harming the morale and readiness of our military today in all of the services. I provide those examples. One Air Force leader said recently, if you're not flying your aircraft because it's grounded, you might as well go fly something else. I provide these examples because it's important for us to understand that our actions in Congress are presently and materially degrading our military's ability to defend the nation and protect our interests abroad. This is not an abstraction, especially at a time when international threats and instability are growing and not lessening. I acknowledge there's a fatigue after more than a decade of war. Cutting the defense budget seems an easy way to ameliorate the nation's dire budget problems, but such thinking is wrong. I remember the troop cuts and the budget reductions after Vietnam. I remember that it took us 15 years to restore the military to the proficiency and capability and professionalism that we have today. Defense represents less than 20% of total government spending. We could zero out the entire defense budget, would still, with the growth of entitlement spending and prevalence of tax loopholes, not be able to reduce the federal deficit. I've worked with colleagues for 2 years to try to address this issue. I've toured the country with Kelly Ayotte and Lindsey Graham, and met community and business leaders. I joined with our distinguished chairman, Carl Levin, hosted a series of meetings with senators to find common ground. None was to be found. So here we are, my friends, with an obvious impact for next year of sequestration, which would dramatically impact our ability to defend this nation. So in desperation, I'm asking my colleagues to at least agree to smoothing out this path, which would end up with the same reductions in spending, but at least not hit this bottom level, which will cause us to have planes that won't fly, ships that can't sail, and men and women in the military unable to train and operate. And once we reduce and impact operations and maintenance, readiness suffers, and readiness incapability only shows up over time. I spent last Sunday with my friend from Tennessee, the senator from Tennessee, and I were at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where we spent some time with the men and women who are serving in the military. We were briefed by the military leadership and the command master sergeants of the various units that are based at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. We found that already the ability to train, the ability to retain, the ability to act with the kind of proficiency which is necessary in today's world is already being seriously degraded. So I asked my colleagues, in working with Senator Sessions, and this will be a Sessions amendment, to consider at least this amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act so that we can at least soften the blow to some degree of sequestration. Senator Lamar Alexander and I were taken by the patriotism and the hard work and the quality of the men and women who are serving our nation in the United States Army at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. But Senator Alexander and I were both deeply alarmed at the fact that these people are literally having to budget and operate on a month-to-month basis. They are not able to sustain the level of readiness and capability that this nation needs at this very difficult time. So I urge my colleagues to consider this amendment that Senator Sessions will be sponsoring, and I look forward to debating and hopefully passing this legislation to give the men and women the relief that they need to serve this country with the patriotism, but now with the efficiency that we need in these difficult times. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.